The summer Clara Voss arrived in Cutter's Bend, Kansas, nobody paid much attention. That was in June of 1886, and the town had seen its share of drifters, widows, and quiet people who came and went without explanation. She rode in on the afternoon stage from Dodge City, a single trunk strapped to the roof, a leather satchel held in her lap, and eyes that moved over the main street, the way a surveyor's eyes move over land, not admiring it, not judging it, simply measuring it. She was 38 years old with dark hair threaded through with early silver and hands that were too calloused for a woman who had never done physical work. The station master noted later that she asked him only one question when she stepped down from the coach where the county land office was. Not where the hotel was, not where she could find a meal. The land office. Cutter's Bend in the summer of 1886 was the kind of town that believed it understood itself completely. It had a main street of packed earth and 12 buildings that mattered, a general store run by a man named Fletcher Cobb, who was also the town's reverend on Sundays, a saloon that doubled as the unofficial courthouse for minor disputes, a livery stable, a post office the size of a large closet, a small schoolhouse that smelled of chalk dust and mouse droppings, a bank with a vault that everyone knew held less than it implied, and a scattering of houses that ranged from modest to barely standing. The surrounding land was flat in the way that Kansas flatness becomes something almost philosophical, not merely the absence of hills, but the presence of pure, uninterrupted horizon sky pressing down on earth with nothing to mediate between them. Winters came hard and left slowly. Summers burned. The people who stayed were the ones who had decided consciously or not. That endurance was its own form of meaning. Edmund Hargrove had farmed the same 300 acres east of town for 19 years. He was 51 wide through the shoulders with a face the color of old saddle leather and a disposition that most people in Cutter's Bend described as solid, which meant he was reliable, rarely wrong about weather or soil, and not particularly interested in things that didn't concern him directly. His wife Ruth was 44, quieter than Edmund in public and considerably sharper in private, the kind of woman who finished her husband's sentences in her head 3 beats before he spoke them and had learned to keep that particular talent invisible. Their son Will was 8, gap-toothed and serious in the way that children raised around livestock often become serious, accustomed to consequence, and aware that living things could fail without warning. The Hargroves knew the old Grady property the way everyone in the county knew it, as a lesson in what happened when a man bet everything on a single bad season and lost. Old Thomas Grady had built his farm in the early 1870s, when the land seemed generous, run cattle and wheat through 2 decent decades, and then watched everything unravel in a succession of dry summers and creditor visits that left him with nothing but the deed and the embarrassment of still being present while his operation collapsed around him. He died in 1879, and the property sat untouched for 7 years after that. The house had gone to rot. The outbuildings had buckled and leaned. But the silo, that tall cylindrical tower of rusted metal that Grady had built in 1874 to store winter grain, still stood. It stood because it was too solid to fall easily and too ugly to steal. The county assessor had listed it 3 times as a demolition liability. Nobody had ever gotten around to tearing it down. Clara Voss walked into the county land office on the afternoon of July 9th and purchased the entire Grady property, house ruins, collapsed outbuildings, 160 acres of flat exposed prairie, and the silo for $340 in paper currency. She placed the money on the desk of the county clerk, a thin man named Aldous Fenwick, who had processed land transactions for 11 years and had never once seen a buyer decline to negotiate. She did not ask for a survey. She did not request an inspection delay. She did not lower her offer by a single dollar or ask a single question about mineral rights, water access, or the condition of the existing structures. She signed the documents in a careful, unhurried hand, folded her copy, placed it in her satchel, and walked out. Aldous Fenwick told the story at the saloon that same evening, and the story spread from there in the way that stories always spread in small towns with each retelling, gaining one additional layer of strangeness, until by the following Sunday it had acquired the quality of a rumor that everyone believed without anyone being able to say exactly why. The widow had paid cash. The widow hadn't negotiated. The widow had bought the one piece of land in the county that nobody else wanted, and she had bought it without looking at it first. Silas Pruitt, who owned the town's general mercantile and had fingers in most of the county's minor financial dealings, said it at the Sunday gathering before Reverend Cobb had even finished his opening prayer. Either she's hiding something or she's lost her mind. No third option presents itself. Clara spent the first 2 weeks at the only boarding house in Cutter's Bend, a 4-room operation run by a widow named Hester Mills, who served breakfast at 6 and expected guests to be off the premises by 7. Clara was always off the premises by 6:30. She ate quickly, spoke little, and was seen each morning walking the 2 miles out to the Grady property along the road that ran northeast of town, carrying her leather satchel and sometimes a rolled paper tube that people assumed contained architectural drawings of some kind, though nobody had gotten close enough to confirm it. She would return in the evening, eat whatever Hester left covered on the kitchen table, and go upstairs. The sound of her moving around in her room stopped early each night, suggesting she was either asleep or simply sitting still in a way that was indistinguishable from sleep. Ruth Hargrove was the first person to attempt a direct conversation. She caught Clara at the post office on a Wednesday morning in mid-July, waiting for the mail wagon that was running late due to a broken wheel somewhere outside of town. Ruth had brought a jar of preserved peaches as an offering, a gesture so common in that part of Kansas that it required no explanation, and she extended it with the kind of genuine warmth that made people trust her instinctively. Clara accepted the jar, turned it once in her hands as if reading the glass itself, and said something Ruth had not expected. "What kind of winter did you have here in '82? Ruth blinked. She said it had been cold. Clara asked how cold specifically, whether the livestock losses had been significant, whether the water lines had frozen in the wells. Ruth answered each question with increasing bewilderment, and at the end of it, Clara nodded, thanked her for the peaches, and looked back toward the road. Ruth stood there for a moment and then said, "You're welcome to come by the farm anytime, Mrs. Voss." Clara's response was quiet enough that Ruth almost missed it in the noise of the street. "I appreciate that, but I expect you'll come by mine first." By the end of July, the wagons had begun arriving at the Grady property. The first load contained stone and lime mortar. The second carried heavy timber beams of a gauge more suited to bridge construction than to anything one might build on a farm. The third load baffled everyone most completely, tightly packed bales of straw wrapped in oilcloth. Dozens of them followed by cut sod blocks the size of bread loaves, stacked on flatbed wagons that groaned under the weight. Not a demolition crew, not scrap buyers, builders. The kind of builders who, when Silas Pruitt rode out to make casual inquiries under the pretense of neighborly interest, gave him only their names in the name of the contractor who had hired them from Dodge City and refused to answer questions about what exactly they were constructing. Silas reported back to the saloon with visible irritation. The workers were tearing the interior of the silo completely clear, hauling out decades of compacted grain dust, broken mechanisms, and rusted hardware. But they were not dismantling the shell itself. They were reinforcing it. He had seen them with his own eyes welding iron braces along the interior walls in a pattern that made no architectural sense to him, running from floor to ceiling in overlapping arcs. They were also laying a new foundation slab inside the existing structure, deeper than the original base, sealed with a lime and sand mixture applied in careful layers and left to cure between applications. Edmund Hargrove listened to all of this from his usual chair near the window and said after a long pause, "She's turning that silo into something that doesn't want to fall down." Silas gave him a sharp look. Edmund shrugged. "I'm not saying it's sensible. I'm saying it's deliberate." What happened next was the straw bales. Over the course of 3 weeks in August, the workers installed them in layers against the interior walls of the silo, packing them tight and then covering each layer with a coat of plaster made from local clay and horsehair, an old technique that the original sod house settlers had used to seal their earthen walls against the wind. The effect was to reduce the interior diameter of the silo considerably while dramatically increasing the density of the walls, which were now in cross-section, something like 18 inches of curved iron, followed by packed straw, followed by clay plaster, followed by another inch of whitewash. A thermal shell. Not insulation in the modern sense, but a layered resistance to temperature change that would hold warmth inside or cold outside depending on the season, in the same way that a root cellar holds its underground temperature against the surface world. Nobody in Cutter's Bend recognized it for what it was because nobody was thinking in those terms. They were thinking in terms of what they knew barns were for animals, houses were for people, silos were for grain. What Clara was building fit none of those categories, and the failure to categorize it produced a specific kind of social discomfort that in small towns almost always resolves itself into mockery. At Fletcher Cobb's general store, where he presided over transactions of both commerce and opinion with equal authority, the consensus formed and hardened within the span of 1 week. The widow from wherever she came from had lost her husband and possibly her good sense along with him, and was spending his insurance money on an elaborate folly that would make good fireside conversation for years to come. Clara did not appear to hear any of it. She was on the property every morning before the workers arrived and still there after they left, moving through the structure with a lantern in the early evening, checking things only she could evaluate. She had hired a man named George Platt from Dodge City, not a laborer, but an engineer of the practical frontier sort who had spent 15 years building mine supports and irrigation channels. And she and Platt could be seen in earnest conversation at odd hours, crouched over drawings, spread on the wagon tailgate, speaking in the low, urgent tones of people working through a problem that has real consequences. It was during one of these evenings that Ruth Hargrove came out alone, as she had told herself she would not do, driven by a curiosity she had been suppressing for 3 weeks. She walked to the edge of the property and stood watching until Clara looked up from the drawings and saw her. Clara did not signal her over or wave her away. She simply looked at her with the flat, open gaze of someone who had anticipated this visit and had already decided how to receive it. Ruth came closer, close enough to see the detail of the foundation, work the thickness of the layered walls, the care with which every joint had been sealed. She stood there for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "What are you building this for?" Clara was quiet long enough that Ruth thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, "You can see it, Mrs. Hargrove, but you won't understand it yet, not until you need to." Ruth went home that evening with a feeling she could not name, something between offense and unease, and told Edmund about it. Edmund snorted and said the woman was peculiar. Ruth said nothing, which Edmund, after 19 years of marriage, correctly interpreted as disagreement. The heavy steel door arrived in September on a specialized wagon from a foundry outside Wichita. It was 3 inches thick, hung on forged hinges the diameter of a man's wrist, and fit into a reinforced stone frame that had been set into the base of the silo with a precision that suggested the measurements had been taken and checked multiple times. It was the kind of door you would find on a bank vault or a mine shaft, not because it needed to lock against people, but because it needed to seal against pressure, against wind, against the particular physics of cold air, seeking warm air through any gap it could find. George Platt himself oversaw the installation, adjusting the frame alignment 3 times over 2 days before he declared it satisfactory. When it closed for the first time, the sound it made was not a slam, but a deep, settled click, the sound of something fitting exactly where it was meant to fit. The door was what finally broke the town's amusement and replaced it with something more complicated. Because a door like that said something. It said the person who ordered it was not building a curiosity or a folly or even an eccentric home. It said they were building something that needed to withstand force. And in the flat exposed grassland of southern Kansas in the autumn of 1886, force meant one thing: weather. Silas Pruitt stood outside the mercantile 3 days after the door arrived and said to anyone within earshot, "She's bearing it now. Did you all see hauled in 6 wagon loads of fill dirt, and she's packing it around the base?" He was right. Clara had hired a separate crew to begin moving soil wheelbarrow loads from the slight rise north of the property and banking it against the exterior walls of the silo in a long, gradual slope that rose from ground level to a height of about 4 feet against the silo's base, covering the lower third of the structure and transforming its silhouette from a cylinder standing on the flat earth to something that appeared to grow out of a low hill. The effect on the thermal mass was significant and deliberate. Packed earth is an excellent insulator and an even better wind deflector, and a structure with its base buried in soil behaves very differently in extreme cold than one with its walls exposed to open air. Clara had native grass seed mixed into the topmost layer of fill, and by the time the first hard frost arrived in October, Thin green shoots had begun to knit the new slope into the existing prairie surface, blurring the boundary between the man-made and the natural. Standing at the edge of the Hargrove property on an October morning, Edmund had to look twice to find it. The structure he had been watching take shape all summer had become somehow a part of the landscape. Not invisible, the steel door was still visible if you knew where to look, and the capped exhaust pipe at the top still broke the horizon but integrated in a way that suggested concealment was not the goal. The goal was something else, something more like permanence. It was around this time that Clara went into Fletcher Cobb's general store and purchased enough dried goods and preserved food to supply a household of 15 people for 2 weeks. Sacks of cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork sealed in wax-lined crocks, dried apple rings packed in cloth coffee, hardtack rendered lard in sealed tins. She asked for all of it to be wrapped and loaded onto her wagon without assistance, loaded it herself, and drove it back to the property without explanation. Fletcher Cobb, who was behind the counter when she came in, and who watched the transaction with the careful attention of a man who considers himself the recorder of his community's significant events, said nothing until she had driven away. Then he looked at the customer nearest him. It happened to be Ruth Hargrove, who had come in for thread and said, "That's food for an army, or for a very long time." Ruth did not respond. She was looking at the door Clara had just walked out of. And her expression was the kind that people wear when a feeling they dismissed is beginning, despite their best efforts to feel less dismissible. Clara had been in Cutter's Bend for 4 months when she requested a private meeting with the town's mayor, a wheat farmer named Walt Coombs, who had been elected to the position largely because he owned the most acreage in the county, and people in agricultural communities tend to confuse landholding with leadership ability. The meeting took place in the back room of the bank, which also served as Coombs' informal office. Clara arrived with her leather satchel removed from it, a folded document, a meteorological survey from the United States Army Signal Corps, the federal agency responsible for weather observation at that time, covering temperature data from weather stations across the northern Great Plains over a 30-year period, and laid it open on the table in front of him. She did not begin with a warning. She began with a fact. She said that the temperature data from the past 4 winters in the northern plains showed a pattern of deepening cold that did not match the moderate winters the Kansas grasslands had experienced through most of the previous 2 decades. She said the pattern suggested a probability, not a certainty but a meaningful probability, of a winter of unusual severity within the next 1 to 3 years. She said the structures currently standing in Cutter's Bend, including the farmhouses, the commercial buildings, and the livestock shelters, were not engineered to maintain survivable interior temperatures if exterior temperatures dropped to ranges the northern data suggested were possible. She said this calmly, without drama, in the measured cadence of someone reading from a report they have already internalized completely. Walt Coombs listened. He was not an unintelligent man. He had kept a successful farm operation running through both good years and bad, which requires a kind of practical intelligence that is easy to underestimate, and he did not immediately dismiss what he heard. He looked at the document. He turned a page. He looked at the temperature columns from the Montana and Dakota Territory stations and compared them to the Kansas averages. Then he looked up at Clara and said, "Every year runs different, Mrs. Voss. Cold years, warm years. You can't read a future winter off past ones." Clara held his gaze for a moment. She said, "I'm not reading the future, I'm reading the direction." She folded the document, placed it back in her satchel, and stood. At the door, she paused once but did not turn around. She simply walked out into the October light and did not raise the subject again with anyone in authority. The meeting might have stayed private if Coombs hadn't mentioned it to Silas Pruitt that same afternoon, and Pruitt hadn't mentioned it to 3 other men by supper time. By the following morning, the nature of the meeting had circulated, and the interpretation the town placed on it was almost universally the same. The Voss widow had gone to the mayor with some paper full of numbers from the government and tried to convince him a catastrophic winter was coming, which was the kind of thing people did when they had already decided what they believed and were looking for official confirmation of their fear. The general verdict delivered across the counter of the mercantile and the saloon and the post office in the days that followed was that she had frightened herself with too much reading and was now building herself a very expensive place to hide from a disaster that would probably never arrive. Only Doc Henry Alderman, the county's only physician, said nothing in any of these conversations. He was 61, trained at a medical college in Ohio in the 1840s, and had practiced in frontier conditions for long enough to have developed a particular respect for the kind of knowledge that came not from books alone, but from the combination of observation data and willingness to accept an uncomfortable conclusion. He had treated frostbite every winter of his years in Cutter's Bend. He had signed death certificates that named exposure as cause of death. He had watched animals freeze in barns that people had assumed were adequate and watched water systems fail at temperatures that weren't supposed to be dangerous. He did not think Clara Voss was frightened or foolish. He thought she had read something that the rest of the town hadn't read and was acting on it with a thoroughness that made him privately feel a discomfort he couldn't quite justify as a doctor, but that he understood instinctively as a man who had seen what cold could do. He visited the property once in late October, and Clara showed him the interior without prompting. The space had been divided by the addition of a reinforced wooden platform at the midpoint of the silo's height, accessible by a ladder of iron rungs set into the wall, creating a lower level for habitation and an upper level for storage. The lower level was perhaps 12 feet in diameter, the original interior reduced by the insulating walls on all sides, and contained a small cast iron stove with a flue pipe rising through the center of the upper platform and exiting through a sealed aperture in the dome cap at the silo's top, a design that managed the combustion gases while allowing the stove heat to warm both levels before escaping. There were wooden shelves built into alcoves in the curved walls, a fold-down sleeping platform, a water barrel with a sealed lid, and beside the stove, a neat stack of seasoned hardwood that suggested either obsessive preparation or a very clear idea of exactly how much fuel would be necessary. Alderman looked at the single window, a square of thick glass set into the eastern wall, small enough that it was more a light source than a view sealed with putty around every edge, and said, "This is the light you can see from outside." Clara agreed that it was. He asked how far it was visible on a dark night, and she said she had tested it from the Hargrove property line at a distance of roughly 400 yards and could see it clearly. He looked at that for a long moment. Then he said, "You're expecting people to need to find this place." Her answer came without hesitation. "I'm expecting people to need a place that exists." He left shortly afterward, and in the weeks that followed, he quietly increased his personal stock of medical supplies, which nobody noticed or remarked upon. November came in cold, but not unusually so. The first hard frost killed the remaining garden vegetables across the county. The ponds iced at their edges, and the routine work of winter preparation began. Livestock moved to shelters, water barrels filled and checked, wood stacked and covered, and the 100 small adjustments that the people of Cutter's Bend had been making every autumn for the length of their lives in this place. The rhythm of it was deeply familiar, and familiarity is perhaps the most powerful force in human decision-making, more powerful than data, more powerful than warning, more powerful than the evidence of a steel door sealed into a buried silo at the edge of an abandoned farm. Clara had stopped coming into town entirely by the first week of November. Her supplies were in, her systems had been tested. George Platt had made his final inspection in late October, declared the structure sound in every detail he was qualified to evaluate, and returned to Dodge City with the remainder of his fee. The property now appeared almost completely undisturbed. From a distance, a low grassy rise in the flatland, a steel door barely visible against the slope, a thin metal pipe at the silo's crown. Nothing to suggest urgency, nothing to suggest anything other than the eccentricity of one quiet woman who had spent a summer building something nobody understood. Will Hargrove asked his father about it on a November evening while they were mending fence along the eastern field. Edmund was working a staple loose from a rotted post, and Will was beside him holding the wire taut, and the question came out of nowhere the way children's questions always come. "Why doesn't Mrs. Voss come into town anymore, Pa?" Edmund grunted. He said she was probably staying put on her property where she felt comfortable. Will considered this for a while, squinting at the low shape visible on the horizon to the northwest. Then he said, "She said something would come. Remember, Ruth said that's what she told her." Edmund straightened, looked at the sky, pale and gray and entirely unremarkable, and said, "Well, people who build themselves a bunker and hide in it are almost always wrong. That's why we still have towns. It was, as Edmund would later reflect on with significant discomfort, not his most carefully considered statement. The first week of December arrived without drama. The temperatures were cold, legitimately cold, the kind that made your breath visible and your knuckles ache, but cold in the familiar, manageable way that Kansas winters had always been cold. Ice in the water troughs each morning, extra blankets on the beds, children walking quickly to school with their hands in their pockets. Nothing that required more than the usual adjustments, and the usual adjustments were made without alarm. And yet, Ruth Hargrove woke on the morning of December 8th to a sky that was wrong in a way she could not precisely articulate. It was not stormy. It was not even overcast in the ordinary sense. It was a pale, uniform gray that seemed to press down closer than sky normally sat, as if the distance between earth and cloud had been quietly reduced overnight. There was no wind. The absence of wind was the most wrong thing because there was always wind in Kansas, always some degree of movement in the air, always some direction that the weather was coming from or going toward. The stillness of that morning was the stillness of something held, not the stillness of something peaceful. She stood on the porch for a long time with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, looking at the horizon in every direction, and then looked northwest toward the barely visible rise of the buried silo, and thought about a woman who had read something in numbers that she herself had not read. Then Edmund called from inside that breakfast was getting cold, and she went back in. The temperature fell 2 degrees by noon, 4 degrees by mid-afternoon, and then in the hour between 3 and 4 o'clock on December 8th, 1886, it fell 11 degrees in 60 minutes, and the sky to the north went from pale gray to a color that had no good name, a deep, bruised purple-white that moved toward them not with the speed of a storm, but with the slow, total inevitability of something that had already decided where it was going. Edmund Hargrove stood in his yard and felt the air change against his face, and knew in the way that 19 years of farming the same land teaches a man to know things through his skin before his mind has caught up, that this was not a familiar winter cold deepening on schedule. This was something else. He looked toward the northwest, where the faint outline of the silo's cap was still just barely visible against the darkening sky, and felt for the first time since July the specific and unpleasant sensation of having been certain about something important and having been wrong. Inside the house, Ruth was already pulling every blanket from the cedar chest at the foot of their bed. The next morning brought no sunrise that anyone could identify as such, only a gradual grudging lightening of the sky from black to a gray, so dense and uniform, it looked like the inside of a pewter bowl turned upside down over the entire county. Edmund was up before dawn to check the livestock, and the temperature reading on the mercury thermometer nailed to the barn post stopped him mid-step. It was lower than he had seen it in December in all his years on this land, and it was still falling. The mercury had not found its floor yet. He put extra hay down for the horses and the 3 milk cows and the 8 head of beef cattle in the far shed, then went back inside and told Ruth with the particular quietness of a man trying not to alarm his child that it was going to be a hard day. Ruth, who had already made Will put on 2 pairs of socks and his winter coat before he'd even come downstairs for breakfast, simply nodded and said she knew. The stove was burning as hot as Edmund could make it without risking the flu, and the house was warm enough through the morning, warm enough to feel normal if you stayed away from the walls where the cold had already begun to press through the single-layer plank siding in a way that was more noticeable than usual. The farmhouses in Cutter's Bend were built for the Kansas they expected cold winters. Yes, but Kansas cold, which had its limits. The walls were wood frame with newspaper and sawdust stuffed between for insulation, which worked adequately against the ordinary range of winter temperatures and was entirely insufficient against what was coming. By early afternoon, the county's telegraph line had gone down, not from wind because the wind still had not arrived, which in hindsight was its own warning, but from ice that had begun to form on the wire in a fine continuous glaze that added weight until the line sagged and snapped somewhere between Cutter's Bend and the next station east. Edmund found this out from his neighbor 3 properties over Frank Delano, who had ridden over on a horse that was deeply unhappy about the cold and whose breath came in great panic to clouds against the freezing air. Delano said the temperature at his place had dropped to levels he had no reference for, that 2 of his pigs had already died in the barn, despite what he'd thought was adequate shelter, and that he didn't know what to do. Edmund said he didn't either. It was the most honest thing he had said in months. The wind found them at 3 in the afternoon. Not gradually, not the way wind usually builds from a light touch to a push to a force, but suddenly as though it had been withheld deliberately and then released all at once. It came from the northwest at a sustained velocity that tore the loose snow from every surface and drove it horizontally across the fields in thick white sheets that reduced visibility in less than 10 minutes from a quarter mile to the length of a man's arm. The temperature, already punishing, dropped another 10 degrees in the first hour of wind. And for the first time since the previous summer, the name Clara came back into Edmund Hargroves' mind with a weight it had not carried before. He checked the stove. He checked the wood supply enough for another day, maybe two if he was careful. He checked the water in the kitchen barrel and found it was already developing a skim of ice despite being inside the house. He went to the bedroom window and scraped a clear patch in the frost that had formed on the inside of the glass and looked out at nothing, just white moving, white featureless, and total. And then he went to find Ruth. She was already in the kitchen with Will wrapping extra layers of clothing around the boy with the systematic efficiency of a woman who had shifted from domestic routine into survival mode without crossing any visible threshold. Will was not crying or frightened in the way of children who have been warned into fear. He was quiet and watchful, which was somehow more difficult to witness. Ruth looked up at Edmund when he came in, and between them passed the wordless recognition that married people who know each other completely can transmit without speech that the situation had changed in a way that required them to acknowledge it plainly, even with the child present. Edmund said, "The house is going to keep losing heat. The wood won't last past tomorrow night at this rate." Ruth said, "I know." Will said, "Is Mrs. Voss's silo still out there?" Neither of them answered immediately. Edmund went back to the window and this time looked northwest past the driving snow into the dark that was forming at the edge of visibility. And there, faint and unmistakable, because she had tested it from this property line and confirmed it could be seen from 400 yards, and whoever had built that structure had been precise about every detail they had committed to, there was a light. Small, yellow, entirely steady, not flickering the way open flame flickers. Constant, burning behind thick glass in a wall that had been sealed with putty against every current of air. Edmund stared at it for a long time. Then he turned back to the room. "Start putting on everything warm you own," he said. "Both of you, every layer, every—" Ruth did not ask whether this was the right decision. She had made her own judgment about it at the porch that morning, looking at a sky that was wrong in a way she could not name, and the judgment had been sitting in her quietly all day waiting. She put on 4 layers of clothing, wrapped Will in every piece of warm fabric she could find that would stay attached to a moving child, and tied them together at the wrist with a length of rope from the barn so that if one of them went down in the dark and the driving snow, the others would know it immediately. They stepped outside into something that had a physical presence beyond mere cold. The wind did not blow around them, but through them, finding gaps in every layer, converting body warmth to nothing in the seconds between heartbeats. The ice on the ground was not the solid, grippy ice of a skating pond, but a thin, treacherous glaze over frozen earth that gave no purchase and cracked in unexpected places underfoot. Will made a small sound when the cold hit him, and then pressed his face into Edmund's coat and was silent for the rest of the journey. The journey was not long. It should not have been long. In ordinary conditions, the walk from the Hargrove farmhouse to the edge of the Grady property was 10 minutes at a moderate pace. In what they were now walking through with the wind pushing against them and the ice beneath their boots and the snow reducing visibility to almost nothing, it became something longer and harder in a way that the words longer and harder failed to fully capture. Ruth fell once caught herself with both hands on the frozen ground and was back up before Edmund had finished turning toward her. Will did not fall because Edmund had his arm around the boy's shoulders the entire time, but his small legs were struggling to move with the slowness that the ice demanded, and more than once Edmund simply lifted him and carried him for 30 or 40 yards before setting him back down. They navigated by the light, that single yellow point in the dark, never moving, never dimming. There was one moment 3/4 of the way across when the wind intensified to a pitch that drove snow so densely between them and the horizon that the light vanished entirely for perhaps 20 seconds, and Edmund stopped walking and the stopness of those 20 seconds was the nearest thing to despair he had ever allowed himself. Then the gust shifted a degree, and the light was there again, exactly where it had been, and they moved. The silo, when they reached it, was not what Edmund had expected, even though he had watched it being built. He had watched the process but had understood it as spectacle rather than engineering, which meant he had cataloged the details without grasping their function. What he understood now, standing at the base of the earthen slope that rose to meet the steel door, was that the structure looked nothing like a shelter because it did not need to perform the visual language of shelter. It performed the function of shelter, which was a different thing entirely. The door was set into the slope as if it had always been there. The grass on the banked earth was now dead and brown with frost, but still intact, still holding the soil together. The structure above was barely visible in the dark. The snow and wind and cold had reduced the world to the distance of your own hands, and the silo's top disappeared into that darkness above the doorframe without drama. Edmund raised his fist and struck the door. The sound it made was not the ringing sound of a fist against thin metal, but a dull, absorbed thud. The sound of force meeting something that declined to transmit. It declined to vibrate. With it simply received the impact and returned nothing. He struck it again and again. Ruth had her arms around Will from behind her face, turned to shield herself from the wind, and he could see, even in the darkness, that she was depleted in a way that hours of sustained cold depletes even capable people. He struck the door a fourth time with the full weight of his body behind it. The click that followed was the most precise sound Edmund Hargrove had ever heard in his life. Mechanical, deliberate, unaffected by the storm because whatever mechanism operated that lock was entirely interior to the sealed structure and had nothing to do with weather or cold or the chaos of the world outside it. The door moved inward, not swinging but withdrawing, controlled, deliberate, drawing the cold air with it in a brief contained rush. And the warm air that came out was not a blast, not a surge, but a steady, even pressure that simply replaced the cold air where they stood, as though the inside of the structure had decided without fuss to extend itself slightly outward to meet them. Clara Voss stood in the doorway. She was wearing her ordinary clothing, a dark wool dress, her hair pulled back, and she was entirely calm in the manner of someone whose readiness for this moment had been so thorough that the moment itself required no adjustment. She had known in some exact and measurable way that people would come to this door. She had not known who or how many or precisely when. She had known because she had understood what the structure was built to withstand and had therefore understood what events would create the need for it. Her expression was not triumph. It was not relief. It was the face of someone who has been right about something important and finds no pleasure in the correctness itself, because the rightness of the prediction implied the reality of the thing predicted, which was not something to be pleased about. "Get inside," she said. It was not a welcome or an invitation. It was an instruction offered with the economy of someone who understood that the moment between outside and inside was itself a form of vulnerability, and that every second in the doorway was a second in which the cold had access to what the door was designed to refuse it. They crossed the threshold. The door closed behind them with the same precise click it had made opening, and the storm, the wind, the ice, the annihilating cold, the darkness became a muffled, distant presence that pressed against the outside of the structure and received nothing back from it. Not silence exactly, more like the memory of sound. Ruth stood just inside the door with Will pressed against her side and looked around at what Clara had built, and the expression on her face was the kind that people wear when reality reorganizes itself around a fact they had not adequately imagined. The stove put out an even, radiating warmth that did not create a hot zone and a cold zone, but distributed itself through the circular space with the efficiency of a room that had been designed around its heat source, rather than a heat source added to a room as an afterthought. The light from the 4 kerosene lamps positioned at points around the curved wall was warm and steady and reached every corner of the space. The smell was wood smoke and dried beans and something faintly mineral from the clay plaster in the walls, and it was the smell of a place that had been lived in, that had been tended, that was not holding together by effort, but by design. Ruth looked at the shelves with their organized stores, at the sealed water barrel, at the folded blankets, stacked with military precision on the sleeping platform, and understood in the full wordless way that understanding sometimes arrives, that What she was standing in was not eccentric or excessive or paranoid. It was competent, radically, extraordinarily, thoroughly competent. Will pulled at her sleeve. His voice when he spoke had recovered some of the warmth that the cold outside had temporarily taken from it. She knew we'd come. Ruth looked at Clara, who was already at the stove, lifting the lid from a pot that had been sitting there at low-heat bean soup, dense and hot, and ladling it into a tin cup. Clara brought the cup to Will first without being asked, without ceremony, and held it out to him with the matter-of-fact generosity of someone who had calculated exactly this necessity into her preparations and was now simply executing the calculation. Edmund stood near the door, not blocking it, not intending to leave, but positioned there in the way that men position themselves near exits when they are processing something they haven't finished processing. He looked at Clara's back while she worked at the stove, and he thought about the morning in October when he had told his son that people who build bunkers and hide in them are almost always wrong. He thought about the tone he had used, the certainty of it, the small pleasure he had taken in the common-sense dismissiveness of it. He thought about his boy's face in the cold and his wife's hands on the ice-covered ground. He thought about the light in the dark constant and yellow burning behind thick glass in a wall nobody had built by accident. Clara turned from the stove and handed a second cup to Ruth and then looked at Edmund. She did not ask if he was all right. She did not offer comfort or recrimination. She simply looked at him with the level, patient gaze of a woman who had been right about something for a very long time and had never needed him to acknowledge it. She held out the third cup. Edmund crossed the room and took it. Outside, the storm pressed against the buried walls and found nothing to enter through. The earthen slope deflected the wind. The layered straw and clay absorbed what the slope didn't deflect. The iron shell beyond that held everything together, braced at intervals by the welded arcs that George Platt had declared satisfactory. The glass in the east-facing window was the only transparent surface in the entire structure, and it was set so deeply into the wall and sealed so thoroughly that the wind could not find the edge of it. The light behind the glass was still burning. It would keep burning. Edmund Hargrove drank his soup and looked at the curved wall across from him, at the layered surface, the careful shelving, the lamp casting its circle of warmth, and felt the specific gravity of a man in the presence of something that had been right all along. The knock at the door came 40 minutes later. Clara was already moving toward it before the second knock landed. The second knock came from two people, not one. Clara opened the door and found Frank Delano and his wife, Agnes, on the slope. Frank with a lantern that had blown out somewhere in the crossing, and Agnes with her arm around their teenage daughter, Nora. All three of them coated in a shell of ice that had formed across their outer clothing during the walk in a way that made them look less like people and more like versions of people that the cold had been in the process of replacing with something harder and less alive. Frank's mustache had frozen solid against his upper lip. Nora was not crying, but her eyes had the particular unfocused quality of someone whose body has begun redirecting resources away from non-essential functions, and the eyes in the cold's accounting were non-essential. Clara stepped aside. All three of them came in. The door closed. Edmund watched Clara move immediately to the sleeping platform, where the spare blankets were stacked, and begin distributing them with the efficiency of someone working from a pre-existing plan rather than improvising, which was exactly what she was doing. Frank Delano stood in the middle of the lower level with his hands held slightly away from his sides, the posture of a man whose fingers were too cold to press against anything, and looked at the interior of the structure he had ridden past 100 times in the past 6 months without once considering as a destination. His eyes moved over the stored provisions, the sealed water barrel, the organized lamp placements, the cast iron stove radiating its steady, even heat, and his face moved through several expressions in quick succession. Recognition, disbelief, something that was almost anger before it became something more difficult to label. He had told his wife in August, within earshot of at least 4 other people, that the Voss widow was either a lunatic or a criminal, and that the county ought to look into whether she was storing stolen goods in that metal tower. He did not say this now. He sat down on the floor near the stove with his hands extended toward the heat and said nothing at all, which was, given the circumstances, the most appropriate response available to him. Agnes Delano was made of different material than her husband. She had been a school teacher in Missouri before she married Frank and followed him west, and she retained from that life a capacity for rapid assessment that domestic farming had not entirely eroded. She looked at the shelves, looked at Clara, looked at the thickness of the walls visible at the doorframe, where the insulating layers were exposed in cross-section, and said, "How long did you plan for?" Clara was wrapping a blanket around Nora's shoulders and did not look up. "Long enough." Agnes absorbed this and then moved to help, with Nora understanding instinctively that the question had been answered as fully as it was going to be answered, and that the more useful activity was the one directly in front of her. The temperature inside the silo held at something between 55 and 60 degrees, which was not warm in the way that a heated house is warm, but was warm in the way that survival is warm, adequate, sufficient enough. The stove consumed wood at a rate Clara had calculated with precision during the months of preparation, and she had stacked enough seasoned hardwood in the upper level to maintain combustion for 8 days at the current burn rate, with a reserve calculation built in for the possibility of additional bodies requiring additional heat. She had known in the abstract way that people who think carefully about systems know things, that if one family needed shelter, then the probability of others needing it was not meaningfully different. She had provisioned accordingly. The mathematics of it were not remarkable to her. What she had found remarkable during all those months of building was that no one else in the county appeared to be doing any mathematics at all. The third knock came 90 minutes after the Delanos. This time it was a single person, a young man named Theodore Marsh, who worked as a hand on the Alderman property and who had been caught in the open when the wind hit, had found his way to the Delano farmhouse, only to discover it empty, and had then followed the only visible reference point in the darkness, with the single-minded focus of a man who has reduced his goals to one because one is all he has the capacity to manage. He was 23 and in good physical condition, which had probably kept him alive, and he came through the door with the controlled gratitude of someone who understands that they came closer to a bad outcome than they will ever fully admit in polite company. He sat in the corner nearest the door, wrapped himself in the blanket Clara gave him, and was asleep within 20 minutes, which was the correct response, and one that Clara noted with approval, because a body that sleeps is a body that conserves. Edmund had taken up a position near the stove, not because he was cold, he had warmed considerably, but because the stove was the operational center of the space, and standing near it gave him something to do with his attention. He was watching Clara with the close observation of a man recalibrating a judgment he had held for a longish time, examining each detail of her behavior, the way he might examine a piece of equipment he had dismissed as unnecessary and then found himself depending on. She moved through the space without wasted motion. She checked the water barrel level. She adjusted the stove damper by a precise increment and then stood still for a moment, measuring the result in the heat output before she was satisfied. She counted the remaining provisions on the shelves with a glance that suggested the numbers were already in her head, and she was only confirming what she already knew. She did all of this while simultaneously tracking the condition of every person in the room. Not intrusively, not in the hovering away of someone performing care, but in the background continuously, the way an engineer monitors gauges while doing other work. Ruth was beside Will on the floor with her back against the curved wall. Will had eaten his soup and fallen into the half-sleep of exhausted children, his head on his mother's leg, his breathing slow and even. Ruth was not sleeping. She was watching Clara. She had been watching Clara since they arrived with the focused attention of a woman who has been wrong about something important and is now trying to understand not just that she was wrong, but how she was wrong, what specific failure of observation or imagination had produced the error. The answer, as it assembled itself in Ruth's mind over the hours, was uncomfortable. In its simplicity, she had judged Clara by what she was building rather than why she was building it, and she had decided why she was building it based on the assumption that no plausible reason existed rather than looking for the reason. It was the kind of mistake that is easy to make about people who don't explain themselves. And it was not a mistake Ruth intended to make again. The fourth knock came just before midnight. Clara was already on her feet when it landed, which meant she had heard something in the wind, outside, a change in the quality of the sound perhaps, or some faint transmission through the earthen walls that the others had not detected. She opened the door to Doc Henry Alderman, who was 61 years old and had just walked 3/4 of a mile through conditions that had incapacitated men 30 years younger, and who came through the door with his medical bag in one hand and his other arm supporting a woman who was obviously in the late stages of pregnancy and who was equally obviously not where she had expected to be tonight. The woman was May Pickett. She was 31 years old, the wife of a cattle hand named Roy Pickett, who was somewhere out on the winter range and had been since November doing the work that kept other people's cattle alive at the cost of his own comfort and occasionally his safety. May had been staying with a neighbor family 2 miles northeast when the storm hit, and the neighbor's house had lost its roof, not all at once, but in sections, one wall of shingles peeling away in the wind, and then the structural boards beneath flexing and splitting with sounds like gunshots until the gap was large enough that the interior temperature fell to match the exterior within an hour. Doc Alderman had been making his way to that property when he found May already outside and moving with the directional certainty of a woman who had one task and intended to complete it. He had redirected her toward the silo's light, which he had been keeping in his peripheral vision since he left his own house. And they had made it together, which was testament to May's physical endurance and Doc Alderman's navigational clarity under pressure. May Pickett was not in labor yet. She was close in the way that a person familiar with such proximity could assess not hours away, but not immediately, the distinction being one that Doc Alderman made in his first 30 seconds of examining her by lamplight, while Clara cleared the sleeping platform and brought every spare blanket in the upper storage level down the iron rungs in 4 efficient trips. May was frightened in the measured way of people who have decided that fear is not useful, but have not entirely succeeded in eliminating it. She said, sitting on the platform with her hands in her lap, Roy doesn't know where I am." It was not a complaint. It was the specific grief of a woman whose husband was somewhere in the dark and the cold with no knowledge that the situation had changed, and she was sitting with the knowledge alone. Clara knelt beside the platform, not at May's eye level, but close enough to be seen clearly, and said, "He'll find out when the storm breaks. Right now, the only job is the one in front of you." May looked at her for a moment, and then something in her face that had been held very tight released slightly, not into tears, but into a more sustainable form of bearing what needed to be borne. The wind outside had reached a sustained intensity that on the exposed surfaces of the county's farmhouses and barns was doing structural damage. Edmund knew this without being able to see it because he had spent 19 years learning how wind loads accumulated against the buildings he had put up with his own labor. And he understood from the sound alone, even muffled as it was through the silo's walls, that it had passed the threshold where structures began to fail. He thought about his barn. He thought about the 8 head of beef cattle in the far shed, the shed he had built in the summer of 1881, with green lumber that he had always meant to replace with seasoned timber and never had. He thought about these things with the helpless clarity of a man who cannot act on what he knows and must therefore simply know it, which is its own form of suffering. Will woke sometime around 2 in the morning and lay still for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of the space, the stove settling, the quiet breathing of Theodore Marsh still asleep in the corner, the low conversation between Doc Alderman and Clara near the water barrel, before he sat up and looked around with the immediate full consciousness that children sometimes achieve on waking, as if sleep had been only a brief interruption of attention rather than a genuine absence from the world. He looked at May Pickett on the sleeping platform. He looked at his mother, who had also dozed and was now awake again, with her head tipped back against the wall. He looked at the single window where the glass was completely dark, no light from outside, nothing visible beyond the thick pane but the deep total dark of a storm that had blocked every source of illumination the night sky might otherwise have offered. He asked, "Is it going to stop?" Ruth said she thought so eventually. Will considered this for a moment with the gravity of a child who has been given an honest answer and is now deciding whether honesty was what he wanted. Then he asked, "Why did Mrs. Voss build this before she knew the storm was coming?" The question reached the room in a way that shifted something in the quality of the silence. Doc Alderman looked up from the conversation he was having. Frank Delano, who had not spoken in 2 hours, turned his head. Edmund, standing by the stove, looked at Clara. Clara was at the shelf checking a provision count, and she did not stop what she was doing. She said, "I didn't build it because I knew. I built it because I understood what was possible." She paused with her hand on a crock of sealed salt pork and then continued more quietly. "There's a difference between predicting a thing and preparing for one. Prediction requires certainty. Preparation only requires honesty. The room held that for a moment. Frank Delano looked at the floor. Agnes put her hand over his without comment. The fifth knock came at 3:15 in the morning, and it was not one person but four. The Whitmore family from the south edge of the county, a father and mother and two daughters aged 12 and 9, who had attempted to reach town on their wagon and lost a wheel to the ice on the county road, and then walked the remaining distance on foot, guided by nothing except the faint yellow point of the silo window that they had spotted at the crest of a drift, and then held on to through the remaining half-mile with the desperate concentration of people who know that looking away will cost them the reference. The father, James Whitmore, came through the door with his eldest daughter across his shoulders, not because she couldn't walk, but because she had stopped being able to feel her feet, and he had decided with the quick arithmetic of parenthood under pressure that her feet were more important than his back. Clara had the child's boots off and her feet wrapped in dry wool within 4 minutes of the door closing. 9 people now. 11 including Clara and May Pickett, who was not yet in labor, but whose breathing had changed in a way that Doc Alderman noted and filed without comment. The lower level of the silo was not cramped. Clara's design had accounted for gathering the floor space arranged to allow movement and to position the stove for maximum radiant distribution, but it was no longer spacious either. People were arranged in the organized informality of groups who have been assembled by necessity rather than choice. And the social geometry of it was interesting. The families had naturally clustered, but not exclusively. Theodore Marsh had woken and was sitting with Will Hargrove in the kind of comfortable silence that exists between people who have nothing in common except the present moment, which turns out to be sufficient. Agnes Delano had positioned herself near May Pickett without being asked, because Agnes had delivered 2 of her own children and understood both the physical logistics and the particular loneliness of the event. Clara managed the space the way she managed everything, not through authority, but through action, which has its own authority. When James Whitmore asked about the wood supply, she told him exactly how much was left and exactly how long it would last at the current burn rate. When his wife Harriet asked whether there was water, Clara showed her the barrel and the method for accessing it without disturbing the sealed lid. When Frank Delano asked what they should do if the storm continued past the supply window, Clara said, "It won't." Frank looked at her. She looked back. "The pattern I've tracked doesn't support a duration beyond 6 days. We're in day 1. Frank said, "And if the pattern is wrong," Clara returned her attention to the stove, "then we'll address that on day 7. The quality of honesty in that exchange was remarkable in its absence of reassurance. Clara did not tell the room that everything was going to be fine. She told the room what she knew and what she didn't know, and what she had prepared for, and what fell outside her preparation. This was, as several people in that room would reflect on much later, more comforting than false certainty would have been, because it was the kind of communication that implied the speaker had a clear view of the situation and was sharing it rather than managing it. May Pickett's labor began at 5:30 in the morning quietly with a change in her breathing that Doc Alderman caught immediately, and that brought Clara to the sleeping platform without needing to be summoned. The two of them worked together in the lamplight with the focused coordination of people who had not previously worked together, but who shared a sufficient baseline of practical knowledge that the gap closed quickly. Clara had included in her stored provisions because she had included everything that a clear-eyed assessment of human biological reality suggested might be necessary: strips of clean linen, a small vessel for boiling water, and several items of medical utility that she had purchased from a supply catalog, and that Doc Alderman, when he saw them laid out on the edge of the sleeping platform, recognized with the brief, controlled expression of a man who is impressed and is choosing not to make a production of it. The rest of the room reorganized itself with instinctive tact. Edmund moved the children to the far side of the lower level and engaged Will and the Whitmore girls in a quiet game involving pebbles that he found in his coat pocket, the kind of improvised distraction that revealed to those watching a tenderness in Edmund Hargrove that his ordinary public manner did not advertise. Ruth stationed herself where she could be useful without being in the way. James Whitmore and Frank Delano sat in silence near the door, not speaking, but aware of each other, which was his own form of company. Theodore Marsh had climbed to the upper storage level and could be heard moving provisions with careful, methodical quietness, doing something useful in the only space available to him. The birth took 4 hours. It was not easy. No birth in those conditions. And at that stage of preparation would be easy, but it was also not catastrophic, which was the outcome that mattered. At 9:40 in the morning of December 9th, 1886, a boy was born in the lower level of a buried grain silo on the edge of an abandoned Kansas farm in the middle of the worst blizzard in the recorded history of the Great Plains, delivered by a 61-year-old country doctor by the light of 4 kerosene lamps, while outside the temperature was 30 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, and the wind was moving at velocities that had no good name in the ordinary vocabulary of weather. The child was small but breathing. May Pickett was exhausted but intact. Doc Alderman straightened up from the sleeping platform and said, "He's a good, strong boy," and his voice, for the first time since he had arrived, carried something other than clinical control. Clara stood at the stove with her back to the room for a moment, not because she was moved, or not only because she was moved, but because the information needed to be absorbed and integrated into her understanding of the situation which had changed. A newborn changed the thermal requirements. It changed the supply calculation. It changed the duration of risk. She did this calculation in the time it took her to exhale once slowly, and then she turned back to the room and began doing what the calculation required. Will Hargrove asked his father in a whisper, "What are they going to name him?" Edmund, who had spent 4 hours keeping 3 children, came with pebble games and quiet stories, looked across the room at May Pickett, holding her son in the lamplight, and said, "That's not our question to ask right now." But his voice delivering this correction was softer than his words. The storm did not moderate on the second day. It did not moderate on the third. It pressed against the buried walls with the indifferent persistence of a force that had no relationship to human timeline or human endurance. It was not trying to outlast them. It was simply continuing in the way that extreme weather continues, without intention or awareness of what it is continuing against. The temperature outside dropped to levels that Clara's meteorological data had suggested were possible, and that no one in the room would have believed possible 4 days earlier. Ice formed on the interior of the steel door, despite the silo's thermal envelope, which was a data point Clara filed with interest and some concern, because it indicated the exterior conditions were at the outer edge of what she had engineered for. She addressed it by increasing the stove burn rate slightly and repositioning the people sleeping nearest the door. And she monitored it through the second night with the vigilance of someone who cannot afford to be wrong about the margins they have calculated. On the afternoon of the third day, Silas Pruitt arrived. He came alone. He came without a lamp. He came as far as anyone could determine from his condition, from the direction of town, 2 miles across open country, in conditions that had already demonstrated their capacity to kill, and he arrived at the steel door with the specific quality of diminishment that belongs to a man who has been stripped of every attribute he has used to define himself and is now nothing but the biological fact of a body that needs shelter. His coat was wrong for the cold, a merchant's coat wool and presentable, not a farmer's coat built for exposure. His boots were thin-soled. His hands when he came through the door were the color of old wax. Clara opened the door without hesitation. This was not a moment she found complicated. Whatever Silas Pruitt had said about her in the past months, whatever conclusions he had broadcast through the town, whatever specific injuries his opinions had done to her reputation, none of it was relevant to the question of whether a human being who needed to be inside should be inside. She stepped back. He entered. He did not speak for a very long time. He stood near the door and let the warmth work on him while his hands went through the ugly sequence of returning sensation, and he looked at the room, at the Delanos, at Edmund and Ruth, at the Whitmores, at May Pickett, on the sleeping platform with her newborn son, and whatever accounting he was conducting inside himself during those minutes was visible on his face, in the way that internal accounting is sometimes visible on faces when a person no longer has the energy to manage their expression. Edmund Hargrove watched him from across the room. The two men had known each other for 15 years, done business, argued over cattle prices, shared opinions at the saloon with the comfortable contempt that men who consider themselves practical reserve for people they consider impractical. Edmund thought about all the times he had nodded along to Silas's pronouncements about Clara Voss. He thought about what those nods had cost, not in any material sense, but in the more durable currency of complicity. He thought we built the same prison out of the same materials and locked each other inside it and called it good sense. Silas finally sat down on the floor near the stove with the slow, careful movement of a man whose body has become temporarily unreliable. He looked at Clara, who was measuring out dried beans for the evening meal, with the focused attention she gave every task, and he said nothing. Clara did not look up. The silence between them was not comfortable, but it was honest, which is what silence has become when pretense has been removed by circumstances larger than either party. The fourth day brought the crisis that Clara had been monitoring and that she had not mentioned to anyone. The ventilation shaft, the narrow pipe that angled through the upper dome of the silo, at a downward-facing orientation designed to prevent direct wind entry while allowing combustion gases from the stove to escape, had been accumulating ice around its exterior aperture over the previous 48 hours in conditions that exceeded the design parameters for that component. By the morning of the fourth day, the ice had reduced the effective diameter of the shaft by more than half, which meant the stove was not venting efficiently, which meant the combustion byproducts were beginning to accumulate in the interior air at a rate that was not yet dangerous but would become dangerous within hours if not corrected. Clara detected it by a smell first, then confirmed it by the behavior of the lamp flames, which were pulling slightly differently than they had the previous day, a barely perceptible change in the way they oriented toward the ventilation draw, which was a sign that the draw had weakened. She did not announce this to the room. She went to the upper storage level, found the iron rod she had stored specifically for this contingency, a 3-foot length of quarter-inch bar with a rounded end, and spent 10 minutes determining the exact position and orientation of the shaft blockage by feel and by the sound that the rod made moving through different sections of the pipe. The blockage was at the exterior aperture, which meant it could only be cleared from outside. There was no interior solution to an exterior problem. This was the design's one limitation, and Clara had known about it during construction and had accepted it as the irreducible risk of the ventilation system. She had known that if the worst winter she could imagine arrived and coincided with an ice accumulation scenario she could model but not entirely predict, she might need to go outside to address it. She had prepared for this too, in the way she had prepared for everything, not by eliminating the possibility, but by determining in advance exactly what she would do when it arrived. She told Doc Alderman. She told him quietly in the upper level, away from the rest of the room, and she told him with the specific precision of someone conveying a handoff of critical information rather than asking for permission or comfort. She told him the current accumulation rate, the estimated time window before intervention became urgent, and what she was going to do about it. She told him that if she was not back inside within 15 minutes, he should assume she needed assistance, and that Edmund Hargrove was the most physically capable person in the room for a rescue attempt. Doc Alderman looked at her with the expression he had worn the previous October when he had walked through the silo for the first time, that controlled disciplined attention, and said, "I'll time it." She handed him her pocket watch. She went up and out through the upper access hatch that she had engineered into the dome for exactly this purpose, emerging into the full violence of the storm without warning or gradual preparation. The cold hit her with a totality that her months of intellectual preparation for extreme cold had not fully simulated, because intellectual preparation is a model of a thing and not the thing, and the thing was 30 below zero and wind that took the breath and replaced it with nothing useful. She had a rope tied to the hatch frame and tied around her waist. She moved along the dome by feel her gloved hands finding the handholds she had welded into the iron surface during construction until she reached the ventilation aperture by the specific distance she had memorized 4 feet from the hatch on a bearing 45 degrees to the right. The ice was substantial. She worked at it with the iron rod in both hands, chipping methodically rather than frantically, because frantic work in extreme cold burns energy at a rate the body cannot sustain and produces results inferior to deliberate work. And she had a very clear idea of how much energy she had and how much time she had in which to spend it. The ice came away in chunks. The aperture opened. The draw through the pipe resumed immediately palpable, even in the wind, as a faint upward pull against her fingers when she held them over the opening. She turned back toward the hatch and followed the rope home. When she came back through the hatch into the upper level, her face was white in the particular way that faces go white when circulation has been temporarily redirected away from the surface, and her hands were shaking in a way she could not immediately control. She sat on the storage floor for a moment. Below her, through the platform, she could hear the sound of the room, the children, the stove, the low conversation of people who had been together long enough to find a rhythm in their confinement. She listened to it and let her hands shake and breathe the warming air until the shaking slowed. Then she stood, descended the ladder, and returned to the lower level without comment. Doc Alderman looked at her. He looked at the pocket watch. He looked at her again. 11 minutes and 40 seconds. He handed the watch back without a word. Ruth Hargrove had noticed Clara's absence and her return and the whiteness of her face, and she was one of only two people in the room who understood what it meant. She understood it because she had been watching Clara with sustained attention since they arrived, and sustained attention is how understanding accumulates. She picked up the blanket nearest her and crossed the room and put it around Clara's shoulders. Clara did not refuse it. She sat for a moment with the blanket around her and the stove's heat finding her again, and Ruth sat beside her without talking, because there was nothing to say that the action hadn't already said more clearly. On the evening of the fourth day, Edmund Hargrove asked, "You knew this was coming, didn't you?" Clara was quiet long enough that the question seemed to have been absorbed rather than avoided. "Then I knew something would come eventually." Edmund looked at the fire through the grate of the stove door. "Why didn't you tell anyone? Tell them in a way that made them listen." She met his gaze with the level patience of someone who had asked herself this question and had arrived at an answer she was not entirely comfortable with. Would it have changed anything? The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the specific weight of 14 people in a buried silo in a Kansas winter, full of everything that had been built and ignored and laughed at and survived, full of all the conversations that had happened in the saloon, in the mercantile, and at Sunday services about a woman who was building something no one understood. Edmund Hargrove sat with that silence and did not try to fill it because he was smart enough to recognize that filling it would be a form of dishonesty, and he had been dishonest enough already about things that mattered. The fifth day arrived with a faint, almost imperceptible change in the storm's character. Not a reduction in intensity, but a shift in its quality, the way a held note changes in the last fraction of a second before it ends. Clara detected it in the behavior of the ventilation draw, which had normalized after the clearing of the blockage, and now carried a slightly different pressure than it had the previous morning. She did not announce an end. She said only to Doc Alderman that the pattern was consistent with what she had predicted. He received this information with a nod. The provisions were running closer to their margin than she had expected because she had provisioned for 12, and there were 14 adults and children plus a newborn, and the additional metabolic demands of people recovering from exposure had increased consumption above baseline. She had calculated this shortfall on day 2 and had already implemented the adjustments, smaller portions differently sequenced across the day to maintain perceived adequacy and a reallocation of certain higher calorie stored items from her personal reserve into the common pool. Nobody in the room had noticed the reallocation because she had done it at night. Nobody was going hungry. But the margin that had existed on day 1 had thinned to something that required ongoing management. That evening, with the stove burning at its steady rate, and the room settled into the particular exhausted companionship of people who have been through something together and know they are nearly through it, May. Pickett's son woke from a nap and made the small, fierce sounds of a newborn, asserting in his continued presence. May held him in the lamplight and looked down at him with the expression that belongs only to that specific form of love, recent total slightly disbelieving. The sound of him filled the circular space and bounced off the curved walls and reached every person in the room, and something in the quality of the silence that followed, it was different from every silence that had preceded it. Clara sat on the floor near the stove with her back against the curved wall, and for the first time in 4 days, she was not monitoring something or managing something or solving something. She was simply present in the room in the warmth she had built, listening to the child. Outside, the storm was deciding in the way that storms decide such things that it had done what it was going to do. The light through the east-facing window came gradually, the way light returns after true darkness, not as an event but as a slow accumulation, gray first and then pale gold, rising by degrees until it was present enough to name. Clara saw it before anyone else woke. She had been sitting against the curved wall in the posture she had maintained through much of the night, not quite sleeping, not quite awake, occupying the thin territory between them, that her body had learned to inhabit during the months of construction when there had been too much to think through to permit full unconsciousness. She watched the glass change from black to gray to something that held light, rather than merely refusing darkness, and she understood what it meant, the way she understood most things through the convergence of multiple indicators, rather than any single dramatic sign. The ventilation draw had shifted again overnight, carrying less ice-cold pressure and more of the faintly warmer air that indicated the storm's thermal engine was losing its source. The sound through the walls, that sustained pressured moan that had been the room's constant companion for 5 days, had dropped a register still present, but no longer carrying the same weight behind it. She stood quietly enough that only Doc Alderman, who had been dozing in the corner nearest the medical bag he hadn't released from arm's reach since he arrived, opened his eyes. She moved to the window and looked out through the thick glass at a world that was beginning incrementally to reassemble itself from whiteness into recognizable forms. The slope of banked earth outside the window was visible. Beyond it, the flat sweep of the Grady property was visible, and beyond that, in the far distance, the dark line of the Hargrove fence posts breaking the surface of the snow. Things had edges again. Distance had returned. The storm was not over, but it had reached the point past which it would only diminish. Doc Alderman crossed to stand beside her. He looked at the same view for a long moment. Then he said quietly enough that the room slept on, "You were right about the duration." Clara's response came without pride or relief, carrying only the weight of accuracy. Being right about it doesn't make what's out there easier to look at. He followed her gaze to where the fence post marked the Hargrove boundary and understood what she meant. The world the storm was leaving behind was not the world that had existed before it. It was something that would require accounting, and the accounting would be painful. And being right about the duration was a very small comfort against the scale of what 6 days of that cold had done to a county built for something less. The room woke in stages. May Pickett's son announced the new day with the reliable efficiency he had demonstrated at each feeding, and the sound of him moved through the space and brought people up from sleep one by one in the gentle cellular way that groups wake when they have been sleeping in proximity long enough to have synchronized in some barely perceptible biological way. Will Hargrove sat up immediately, as was his habit, and looked at the window with the direct attention of a child who has been waiting for something and recognizes when it has arrived. The Whitmore girls woke together, the younger one reaching automatically for her sister's hand before she had fully opened her eyes. Theodore Marsh unfolded himself from the corner with the careful deliberation of a young man whose body had stiffened overnight and who was too proud to make noise about it. Edmund was one of the last to wake, and when he did, he lay still for a moment, looking at the curved ceiling above him before he sat up. He had been dreaming about the barn, not a nightmare version of it, but the barn as it actually was, or had been, with the horses shifting in their stalls and the smell of hay and the thin winter light coming through the gaps in the boards. The dream had been specific and accurate in its details, which meant some part of him had been taking inventory in his sleep, cataloging what he had left behind and what he might be returning to and preparing itself for the findings. Ruth was already sitting up with her arms around her knees, watching the window. She had been awake for an hour. She said without looking away from the glass, "It's ending." Edmund sat up fully. He looked at the window, at the quality of the light coming through it, and his chest moved with something that was not quite a breath and not quite a sigh, but occupied the space between them. He did not answer because Ruth had not asked a question. She had made a statement about a fact, and the fact did not require confirmation. Clara opened the steel door at 8:30 in the morning of December 14th, 1886. She did not announce that she was doing it. She simply worked the mechanism and pulled the door inward and stepped to one side, and the cold that entered was a genuine biting, Kansas cold, significant, punishing, not something to dismiss, but it was cold with a ceiling cold that had a known range cold that a person could calculate against and make decisions within. It was not the annihilating, category-breaking cold of the previous 5 days. The wind had dropped to a fraction of its storm velocity. The sky to the east was the particular pale blue of deep winter after a front has passed, clear and high and brilliant with reflected light from the snow that lay across every surface in the county to a depth that would take weeks to fully measure. Edmund stepped outside first. He stood on the earthen slope with his boots sinking slightly into the surface crust and looked across the landscape with the expression of a man who has returned to something he left and is now determining how much of it remains. The Hargrove farmhouse was visible in the distance. He could see even from 400 yards that the roof was intact. The barn behind it was harder to assess at this distance, and the far shed, the one with the green lumber he had always meant to replace, was not visible in the way it should have been, which told him something he was not yet ready to quantify. James Whitmore stood beside him and looked toward his own property, which was in the opposite direction and not visible from where they stood. His face was performing the same calculation Edmonds was working from available evidence toward a probable conclusion, finding the probability uncomfortable and choosing not to voice it. James said after a long silence, "We'll go look." It was addressed to no one specifically or simply to the air, as a statement of necessary intention rather than a plan. Ruth came out with Will and stopped at the crest of the slope, looking at the snow-buried world with the stillness of someone receiving information through their feet as much as their eyes. The native grass that Clara had seeded into the earthen bank, dead now brown and brittle under the frost, had held the soil together through everything. The slope was intact. The structure beneath it was intact. Will pulled his hand from his mother's and walked a few paces down toward the flat ground, then stopped and turned back to look at the door in the dome and the cap of the ventilation pipe, and his expression was the particular expression of children who have understood something they don't yet have words for. Frank Delano came out and walked past Edmund and James without stopping, and stood at the edge of the property looking northeast toward his own farm, with his jaw set and his hands at his sides. Agnes came out behind him and stood beside him without touching him, because she understood that what he needed in this moment was the space to look at whatever he was going to find when he got there, and to begin that process from a distance where the truth was still partly merciful. Theodore Marsh had already left. He had gone through the door 10 minutes before anyone else moving, with the coiled energy of a young man who has been stationary for 5 days and is now pointed towards something with a directional purpose that doesn't wait for group consensus. He had taken a blanket from Clara's reserve without asking, which was a small transgression she noted and forgave simultaneously, and he had set off across the snow toward the Alderman property at a pace that suggested he intended to know the situation there before anyone else knew anything anywhere. Doc Alderman stood in the doorway with May Pickett visible behind him on the sleeping platform, the baby wrapped against her in the swaddling technique Clara had shown her the previous evening. May was not yet ready to travel. Her recovery was proceeding as it should, but that meant she needed another day of warmth and rest before cold exposure was advisable, and she had accepted this with the practical stoicism of a woman who had learned in the previous week that stoicism was the most useful thing she owned. Clara came out last. She stood at the top of the earthen slope with her hands at her sides and looked at the county laid out before her in its post-storm condition, white and vast and altered in ways that would take the season to fully measure. She did not take a long time standing there. She had a list of things to do, and the list did not include prolonged contemplation of what she had built or what it had done, because the building was complete and the doing was already done, and what remained was everything that came after, which was its own kind of work. The walk to the Hargrove farm took 20 minutes in the snow, with Edmund leading and Ruth beside him and Will between them, their boots punching through the surface crust at each step. Clara walked with them without being asked, and when Edmund glanced at her sideways as they crossed the open field, she did not look back, only kept her eyes on the farmhouse growing larger ahead of them. The farmhouse was standing. The roof had held along the main structure, though one corner of the kitchen lean-to had buckled under the snow load. The water lines had frozen both of them and would need to be thawed carefully over several days. The front door had sealed shut with ice in the frame and required Edmund's shoulder against it 3 times before it gave. The interior temperature when they entered was not much above the exterior. Everything that had held warmth had spent it entirely, and the house had gone cold down to its bones. The barn had fared better than the far shed which had lost its roof. Edmund stood in the snow, looking at the collapsed shed for a long time with Will beside him. 4 of the 8 beef cattle in the shed had died. The other 4 had survived by the chance geometry of where they had been standing, when the roof came down pressed together in the northeast corner, furthest from the collapse, alive but depleted, standing very still with their heads low. Edmund went to them without a word and began the process of assessing each one, running his hands along their sides, checking their eyes, doing the inventory of a man whose relationship with these animals was not sentimental, but was also not nothing. Will watched his father with his hands in his coat pockets. He had the face of a child who is learning in real time that the world contains losses that cannot be argued with, only absorbed. Ruth put her hand on his shoulder from behind, and he leaned back slightly into the pressure without turning around. Clara had gone directly to the farmhouse kitchen and started the stove from the wood box Edmund had left stocked before the storm. By the time Edmund came back from the shed, she had the stove drawing well and a pot of water set to heat. Edmund came in with the particular heaviness of a man who has just done a count and doesn't like the number. He stood by the door and looked at the stove burning in the way it had always burned in the kitchen, that had always been his kitchen, and the normalcy of it against the abnormality of everything outside produced a dissonance that sat in his chest without resolving. He said, 4 cattle. Shed roof's gone. We'll need to rebuild before spring. Ruth nodded. She said, we'll figure the timber. Edmund looked at Clara, who was tending the stove with her back to the room. He said, the way she built that insulated storage off the silo, the way she layered it. He stopped. Clara did not turn around. He said, I want to understand how she did that. For the new shed. Clara set down the stove tool she was holding and turned. She looked at him with the flat, level gaze that had been read as coldness by everyone in the county for months, and that Edmund now read as something else entirely, a form of attention so complete it had no need of performance. She said, come by when you're ready. I'll show you everything. The reckoning with Silas Pruitt happened 3 days later. He was not a man who apologized in words. He had built his entire social architecture on the premise that his judgments were reliable, and an apology in words would have required him to dismantle that architecture publicly, which was beyond what the storm had stripped from him. What the storm had stripped from him was the certainty, not the pride, and pride without certainty is a smaller thing, but it is still there. He came to the silo on the morning of December 17th with a wagon carrying seasoned timber planks and a set of iron hinges matching those on the steel door. He unloaded everything without speaking to anyone, stacked it neatly against the earthen slope, and then stood looking at where the door frame had been slightly warped during the storm's worst night, a small displacement invisible to the casual observer, but present to someone who knew what the original alignment had been. He took tools from the wagon and spent 2 hours correcting it. Clara watched for the first 20 minutes and then went back and saw it and did other things. When Silas finished and the door seated properly through its full range of motion, he packed his tools, climbed to the wagon seat, and stopped. He looked at the silo, at all of it, the earthen slope and the dome cap and the single east-facing window, and his face did something that was not quite an apology and not quite acceptance, but occupied the territory between them. The difficult, unglamorous territory where people go when they have been wrong about something important and have decided to acknowledge it in the only way currently available to them. He drove away without speaking. Clara stood in the doorway and watched him go. She did not feel the satisfaction she might have expected, because satisfaction requires that something be over, and the thing Silas Pruitt represented was not over. It was ongoing. There would always be another version of what he had done, other version of what she had built, another season of contempt, followed by another season of consequence. Because that was the nature of the particular human failure she had been watching her whole life. The failure to take seriously what you haven't experienced yet. Doc Alderman wrote his letter on the 20th of December, seated at his desk with a fire in the small stove and the snow still deep outside his window. He wrote to the United States Army Signal Corps in Washington, describing the storm in clinical detail, duration, temperature, minimums, wind velocity, the nature and extent of structural damage across the county. He described the casualties, 2 deaths at the far eastern edge of the county, where an elderly farmer and his wife had been found in their home after the storm broke the interior temperature of the house, having fallen below survivable range sometime in the second night. He described with the same precision the survival of 14 people in a structure of unconventional design built by a woman named Clara Voss on the former Grady property outside Cutter's Bend, Kansas. He wrote near the end of the letter, The design was not the product of formal engineering training as far as I have been able to determine, but of sustained observation, careful reading of available data, and the willingness to act on an uncomfortable conclusion before that conclusion had been validated by experience. I am writing this account because I believe it warrants documentation, and because the two individuals who died in this storm died in a house that was, by the standards of this county, considered adequate. The one structure that was considered by those same standards to be eccentric and unnecessary was the one that lost no one. He sealed the letter and gave it to Will Hargrove, who was passing the office on his way to the schoolhouse, and who carried it to the post office without reading it as instructed. Reverend Fletcher Cobb came to see Clara in the last week of December. He came at mid-morning on a day when the temperature had moderated enough to make the walk from town bearable, and he brought nothing with him and asked for nothing when he arrived. He stood outside the steel door and waited, and Clara opened it and looked at him with the expression she gave everyone, attentive, neutral waiting. He asked if he could come in. She stepped aside. He had been inside his church when the storm hit and had stayed there for the first 2 days burning pews for heat before the temperature inside fell to the point where he had wrapped himself in every piece of fabric available and pressed himself against the remaining wood stove and survived in that way, which was a form of survival that differed from what had happened in this room in ways that were not lost on him. He looked at the shelves, the stove, the window. He looked at May Pickett's sleeping platform, now folded back against the wall. He said after a long silence, "Providence works through prepared hands as readily as through acts of grace." Clara looked at him for a moment, measuring the statement against the man who was making it. She said, "I don't require Providence's endorsement. I required limestone and straw and time." Cobb absorbed this with the expression of a man who has prepared for a certain kind of conversation and found himself in a different one. He said, "I suppose that's one way to see it." She said, "It's the way that built what you're standing in." He left shortly afterward, and his expression as he walked back toward town was the expression of a man carrying a thought he wasn't sure where to put. Roy Pickett made it back from the winter range on December 16th, frostbitten on 2 fingers of his left hand, but otherwise intact, having survived the storm in a dugout shelter with the 3 other hands, and he arrived at the silo on horseback with his hat in his hands and his eyes red from a combination of cold and something that was not cold. He stood in the doorway looking at his wife and his son with an expression that had no name in the ordinary vocabulary of emotion existing in the space, past language, where certain kinds of relief and certain kinds of gratitude live together without needing to be identified. May stayed until January 3rd. On the morning she left, she stood in the doorway with the baby wrapped against her chest and Roy beside her with the horses ready, and she looked directly at Clara with the specific directness of a woman who has understood something clearly and intends the other person to understand that she has understood it. "His name is Daniel. He was born here." Clara looked at the child for a moment. Then she looked at May. She said, "He was born in a good place." May held her gaze for another second, and then she turned and walked to the horse. Edmund Hargrove came back in February, as he had said he would, and he came with Will. They spent the morning going over every aspect of the silo's construction that was visible and accessible, and Clara walked them through each element with the methodical patience of someone who has no investment in being impressive and every investment in being understood. She showed them the straw bale layering technique and how the clay plaster had been applied between layers to seal the thermal mass. She showed them the stove placement relative to the ventilation path. She showed them the foundation depth and why it mattered. At the end of the morning, Edmund stood in the center of the lower level with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim. He said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about prediction versus preparation. I think I spent 19 years predicting winters I'd already survived and calling that preparation." She held his gaze without filling the silence. He said, "That's a different kind of mistake than I thought it was when I was making it." Clara received it without ceremony. She said, "Most mistakes are." He nodded once, put his hat back on, and they went outside. Will lingered at the door for a moment after his father had stepped out. He looked at the stove and the shelves and the window and the iron rungs ascending to the upper level. He said, "Did you know when you were building it that it would work?" Clara looked at him, this serious, gap-toothed 8-year-old who had earned the right to an honest answer through 5 days of quiet, uncomplaining presence in a space that asked more of people than any of them had expected to give. She said, "I knew what the numbers said. I knew what the materials were capable of. Whether it would work was something I couldn't know until it did." Will thought about this with the visible concentration he brought to things that mattered. Then he said, "But you built it anyway." She said, "I built it especially because I couldn't know. That's the only reason building it made sense." He went outside to find his father. Clara stood in the doorway and watched them walk back across the snow toward the Hargrove property. The man and the boy, Edmund's long stride shortened by Will's shorter one, the two of them talking in the way that fathers and sons talk when they are thinking the same thought from different angles and are beginning to find the overlap. The spring came to Cutter's Bend the way it always came, reluctantly. Then all at once, the snow retreating to the low places in the creek beds, while the higher ground dried and the first thin green appeared in the fields around the middle of March. The county was different in the ways that a hard winter always makes a county different. Certain barns were rebuilt along different lines. Certain water systems were relocated below the frost line. Certain conversations happened at the co-op and the general store that would not have been possible before December because the vocabulary for them hadn't existed. These were not large or dramatic changes. They were the small, durable changes that come from experience rather than instruction, which are the only kind that actually last. Edmund Hargroves' new shed used packed sod between its outer and inner walls. James Whitmore had deepened his water lines before the ground refroze in January. Fletcher Cobb had ordered new materials for the church addition that were heavier and better insulated than anything he had used before. None of them said explicitly that they were doing what they were doing because of Clara Voss or the winter of 1886. They didn't need to. The doing was the acknowledgement. The changed building was the changed mind. On a morning in late March, Doc Alderman stopped by, as he had taken to bringing coffee, which was his contribution to their exchanges. He told her he had received a response from the Signal Corps, a formal letter acknowledging his report, noting that the storm data had been incorporated into the national records, and expressing interest in any further observational reports he wished to submit from the region. He read her the relevant section. She listened without expression. She said when he had finished, "They'll build better instruments now, better coverage. In 10 years, the data will be good enough that the predictions will be reliable enough that people will actually listen to them." Doc Alderman looked at his coffee cup. He said, "Do you believe that?" She was quiet for a moment, not because she was uncertain, but because she was being precise. She said, "I believe the instruments will improve." He heard the incomplete nature of the sentence and did not push on it. His own judgment after 61 years of practicing medicine in places where the gap between what people knew and what they did with what they knew was the primary source of preventable suffering was not optimistic on the second point. He drank his coffee, and they sat together in the warmth of the small stove without needing to say anything more. On the 1st of April, Clara began the exterior maintenance that the winter had made necessary. She rechecked every joint in the ventilation system. She applied fresh lime wash to the sections of the exterior iron shell exposed above the earthen slope. She inspected the earthen bank and filled 2 small sections where the native grass hadn't yet fully knitted the surface back together. She checked the window sill and found it sound on every edge. She worked through the morning in the cool spring air, and at noon she sat on the earthen slope with her back against the steel door and ate the lunch she had brought and looked at the county spread before her in its returning greenness. What had changed in Cutter's Bend was not something she could look at directly. It existed in the conversations she was no longer excluded from, in the greetings that carried a different quality than they had before December, in the way Edmund Hargrove's boy had looked at her when he brought a jar of his mother's preserved peaches, the same gesture his mother had made the previous July, but carrying now the weight of everything that had happened between that July and this April. The jar was the same. The weight of it was entirely different. She did not want to be known as the woman who had saved Cutter's Bend. She had not built the silo to be known. She had built it because the data suggested a specific risk, and her character did not permit her to identify a specific risk and then decline to address it on the grounds that addressing it would make her look unusual. The looking unusual was the cost of the preparation, and she had paid it in advance willingly in the currency of their opinions, and she did not feel that the storm had reimbursed her. The storm had simply confirmed what the data had already said. The confirmation was not the point. The preparation had always been the point. She finished her lunch and stood and picked up her tools and went inside. She went to the shelf where the current Signal Corps reports were filed in their oilcloth folder and removed the most recent additions, the ones covering the northern stations, through the end of February. She sat on the floor with her back against the curved wall and opened the reports and began reading. The northern patterns were still in motion. The signatures were early and faint, the way signatures always are before the season that produces them has had time to develop. But they were there in the temperature columns and the pressure readings and the wind direction, data from the stations along the Montana border. And they said what data always says to the person willing to read it without negotiating with it. Something is forming, something will come. Outside, the spring evening settled over Cutter's Bend and the surrounding county with its returning warmth and its long light, and the grass on the earthen slope caught the last of the sun and held it for a moment in a brief ordinary gold before releasing it into the blue of the oncoming dark. The ventilation pipe at the dome's crown stood clear against the sky. The east-facing window was dark from the outside, showing nothing of the interior, giving away nothing of what was happening within the walls. Inside, Clara read the numbers with the attention they required, and the silo waited with the patience of something that had already been tested and had not been found insufficient, and whatever came next would find it exactly as it was ready, standing built not for the winter that had passed, but for every winter that was still approaching.